Everyone in Washington is talking about the binder, because that folder didn't just expose Trump's business corruption, it triggered a domino effect that shook the entire system. Jasmine Crockett had no idea that day that her 5-minute presentation would have 60 minutes knocking on her door, federal agencies rising in rebellion, and an entire generation experiencing their political awakening. The morning of October 15th started like any other Tuesday on Capitol Hill. The House Oversight Committee was scheduled for routine hearings, the kind of procedural sessions that usually attracted minimal media attention and even less public interest. Committee members shuffled in with their coffee and briefing papers, prepared for another day of political theater that would be forgotten by the evening news cycle. But in a modest office 3 floors above the hearing room, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was putting the finishing touches on something that would change American politics forever. She sat at her desk, surrounded by months of meticulous research spread across every available surface. Financial records covered one wall, organized by date and cross-referenced with federal contracts. Timeline charts traced money flows with the precision of a forensic accountant. Bank routing slips were color-coded by property and government agency. This wasn't opposition research. This was a prosecutorial case built with the methodical patience of someone who understood that in Washington, the difference between scandal and consequence was documentation. Jasmine picked up the black leather binder that would soon become the most famous folder in American political history. Inside were 47 pages of evidence that told a story the Trump administration had spent 4 years trying to hide. Active government contracts with Trump-owned properties, generating personal income in direct violation of the emoluments clause and ethics agreements that were supposed to protect the presidency from conflicts of interest. But what made this different from previous investigations wasn't just the scope of the evidence, it was the precision with which it had been assembled. Every transaction was verified, every date cross-checked, every signature authenticated. This wasn't about theoretical impropriety or political accusations. This was about mathematics. Cold, hard, indisputable mathematics. Her chief of staff, Marcus Webb, knocked on the door and entered with a nervous expression. "Congresswoman, your speaking slot is in 2 hours. Are you sure you want to do this?" Jasmine looked up from the binder, her expression calm but determined. "Marcus, how long have you worked in Washington?" 12 years. In those 12 years, how many times have you seen someone get away with something because the evidence was complicated, or incomplete, or buried in bureaucratic language that people couldn't understand? Marcus thought for a moment. Too many to count. "Today," Jasmine said, closing the binder with a soft thud, "that stops." She had requested a standard 5-minute speaking slot during the committee's general session, nothing unusual, nothing that would attract advance attention. Committee members routinely used these slots for grandstanding or making procedural points. The staff barely paid attention to the speaker list anymore. That was exactly what Jasmine was counting on. She had spent weeks preparing for these 5 minutes with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that had made her one of the most effective trial attorneys in Texas before she came to Congress. Every word had been tested, every pause calculated, every visual element designed for maximum clarity and impact. Her presentation wouldn't rely on emotion or political rhetoric. It would be surgical, a methodical dismantling of the carefully constructed narrative that Trump's business interests had been properly separated from his presidential duties. The evidence told a different story entirely. Jasmine's investigation had begun 6 months earlier, not with any grand plan to take down a president, but with a simple discrepancy she'd noticed while reviewing federal spending reports. A routine lodging expense for Secret Service agents had been paid to a property management company that seemed familiar. When she looked closer, she realized it was one of the shell companies that managed Trump's Washington hotel. That single transaction had led her down a rabbit hole that kept getting deeper. What she found wasn't a one-time mistake or an oversight. It was a systematic pattern of government money flowing to Trump properties through a network of contracts, lodging arrangements, and service agreements that had been carefully structured to appear routine while generating millions in personal revenue. The most damaging evidence was also the most straightforward. bank routing records that showed federal payments going directly to accounts controlled by the Trump Organization, despite public assurances that all business interests had been placed in a blind trust. The trust, according to the documents Jasmine had obtained through months of Freedom of Information Act requests and congressional subpoenas, was neither blind nor functional. It was a legal fiction maintained for public consumption, while business operations continued exactly as they had before Trump took office. 2 hours later, Jasmine walked into the committee hearing room carrying nothing but the black binder. She had decided against the usual props and visual aids that characterized most congressional presentations. The documents would speak for themselves. The room was sparsely attended. Maybe 30 people including staff, a handful of reporters, and the committee members who were required to be there. The C-SPAN cameras were rolling, but this wasn't expected to be the kind of session that would generate headlines. Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler called the session to order and began working through the speaker list. Jasmine was 7th on the list, scheduled to speak between a discussion of Postal Service funding and a procedural motion about committee schedules. When her name was called, she stood calmly and walked to the witness table. She placed the binder in front of her, opened it to the first page, and looked directly into the C-SPAN camera. "Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and I want to talk to you about money. Specifically, I want to talk to you about $47 million in federal payments that have been made to Trump-owned properties since January 2017. The room, which had been filled with the usual low-level chatter and side conversations, suddenly went quiet. "This isn't about politics," Jasmine continued, her voice clear and measured. "This isn't about party affiliation or policy disagreements. This is about mathematics. And mathematics doesn't lie." She turned to the first chart in her binder and held it up for the cameras. This document shows federal payments made to Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C., between January 2017 and September 2021. The total amount is $23.7 million. These payments were made by 14 different federal agencies for what were described as routine lodging and conference services. The chart was meticulously detailed, color-coded, and impossible to misinterpret. Each payment was verified, each agency identified, each transaction dated and documented. "What makes this interesting," Jasmine said, turning to the next page, "is that according to the president's financial disclosure forms and public statements, his business interests were placed in a blind trust specifically to avoid these kinds of conflicts of interest." She held up another document. "This is a bank routing slip from Wells Fargo showing the destination account for a $340,000 payment made by the General Services Administration in March 2019. The account holder is listed as DJT Revocable Trust, but the authorized signatories include Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump, both of whom are actively involved in the day-to-day operations of the Trump Organization." The implications were devastating, and Jasmine knew it. This wasn't a blind trust. It was a family business with government contracts. But she wasn't finished. "Mr. Chairman, what troubles me most isn't just the money. It's how routine this has all become. These contracts weren't hidden or disguised. They were processed through normal channels, approved by career federal employees, and paid for with taxpayer dollars. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. The problem is that the system was designed to benefit one family at the expense of everyone else." Jasmine could see that she had the room's complete attention now. Committee members who had been checking their phones were now leaning forward. The handful of reporters present were typing frantically. She turned to what she knew would be her most explosive piece of evidence. "This is where it gets personal," she said, pulling out a thick folder of bank statements. "These documents show that payments from federal agencies to Trump properties were deposited directly into personal accounts controlled by members of the Trump family. Not business accounts, personal accounts." She held up a bank statement with key information highlighted in yellow. "This shows a $127,000 payment from the Department of Defense for conference facilities at Mar-a-Lago being deposited into an account belonging to Donald Trump Jr. 3 days later, that same account was used to purchase an $85,000 boat. The silence in the room was deafening. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jasmine said, her voice taking on the prosecutorial tone that had made her famous in Texas courtrooms, "this isn't a debate about policy or politics. This is a breach of ethics, a breach of law, and a breach of the public trust that makes our democracy possible." The phrase, "this isn't a debate, this is a breach," would later become a rallying cry for an entire generation of young Americans who felt that their government had been sold to the highest bidder. But in that moment, Jasmine was simply stating a legal fact with the precision of someone who had spent months verifying every detail. She closed the binder and looked directly at the committee chairman. "Mr. Chairman, I'm submitting 47 pages of financial documentation to the committee record. I'm also requesting that these documents be referred to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation and to the House Ethics Committee for immediate review." "The evidence speaks for itself," she concluded. "Some things are too important to ignore." Jasmine gathered her materials and returned to her seat. Her 5 minutes were up, and according to the committee schedule, the next speaker was supposed to discuss Postal Service funding. But nobody moved. The room remained silent for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then, Chairman Nadler cleared his throat and called for a 15-minute recess. As committee members filed out of the room, most of them heading straight for their phones, Jasmine sat quietly at her seat. She had done what she came to do. The evidence was now part of the official congressional record. The documents were authenticated and verified. The mathematics spoke for themselves. What she didn't know was that her 5-minute presentation had just triggered the most significant political earthquake in modern American history. Within an hour, video clips of her presentation were being shared on every social media platform. The phrase, "This isn't a debate, this is a breach," was trending on Twitter. Young people who had never followed congressional hearings were creating fan edits that set her words to music. By that evening, her office was flooded with interview requests from every major news outlet in the country. 60 Minutes called personally to ask if she would consider an exclusive sit-down interview. The Washington Post wanted to do a profile. CNN was planning a special segment. Jasmine declined them all. Instead, she went back to her office and continued working. Because what most people didn't understand was that her presentation had been just the beginning. The real work was what came next. The systematic follow-up that would transform 47 pages of evidence into institutional change. And that work was already underway. 3 days after Jasmine's presentation, something unprecedented happened. Federal employees began coming forward. The first was Sarah Martinez, a mid-level administrator at the General Services Administration who had been processing Trump property contracts for 3 years. She contacted ProPublica with internal memos that corroborated every detail of Jasmine's presentation and provided additional evidence that she hadn't yet made public. "We raised concerns about these contracts to legal counsel twice," Martinez told investigative reporters. "We were told each time that the arrangements had been reviewed and approved at the highest levels. But we kept detailed records because we knew something wasn't right." The records Martinez provided were devastating. Internal GSA emails showed career employees expressing concerns about the appearance of impropriety and requesting third-party ethics review for continued contracts with Trump properties. The requests had been denied or ignored. More significantly, the emails showed that GSA administrators had been directed to expedite processing for Trump-related contracts, while similar agreements with other private entities were subjected to standard review procedures. Within a week of Martinez going public, 12 more federal employees from 6 different agencies had contacted journalists with similar evidence. The dam had broken, and the flood of revelations was unstoppable. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source: Congress itself. Representative Adam Schiff called for an immediate expansion of the House Oversight Committee's investigation. Senator Elizabeth Warren demanded a special prosecutor. Even some Republican members began distancing themselves from the administration's explanations. The evidence presented by Congresswoman Crockett raises serious questions that deserve serious answers, said Representative Liz Cheney, one of the few Republicans willing to speak publicly about the revelations. We can't have a system where the presidency becomes a business opportunity. The cultural impact was even more dramatic. "This isn't a debate, this is a breach," became the unofficial slogan of a generation that had grown up watching political scandals disappear into partisan gridlock. Young people shared the phrase on TikTok, incorporated it into protest signs, and used it to describe everything from climate change inaction to student debt policies. Jasmine had inadvertently created a new vocabulary for political accountability. Music producers began sampling her voice in rap songs about corruption and power. Art students created installations featuring blown-up images of her financial charts. Political science professors assigned her presentation as required viewing in courses about effective advocacy. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the federal agencies themselves. The revelation that career civil servants were willing to risk their jobs to corroborate Jasmine's evidence sent shockwaves through the federal bureaucracy. For the first time in decades, government employees felt empowered to speak up about practices they knew were wrong but had been afraid to challenge. The Professional Association of Federal Employees issued a statement supporting the whistleblowers and calling for comprehensive reform of ethics oversight procedures. The American Federation of Government Employees announced that it would provide legal support for any member who faced retaliation for reporting ethics violations. 6 weeks after Jasmine's presentation, the Department of Justice announced that it was opening a criminal investigation into federal contracting procedures. The House Ethics Committee voted to expand its probe into presidential business conflicts. 3 inspectors general announced simultaneous reviews of their agency's contracting practices. But the most telling response came from the White House itself. President Trump, who had initially dismissed Jasmine's presentation as fake news and another Democratic witch hunt, abruptly announced that he was considering placing his business interests in a more transparent trust structure. 2 days later, the Trump Organization quietly terminated several federal contracts and announced that it would no longer bid on government business. It was the closest thing to an admission of guilt that anyone expected to get. On a quiet Friday evening, 6 weeks after her presentation, Jasmine sat in her office reviewing the latest batch of documents that federal employees had provided to congressional investigators. The evidence kept growing, the cases kept expanding, and the institutional response kept accelerating. Her chief of staff knocked on the door and entered with a stack of interview requests. "Congresswoman, 60 Minutes is calling again. They really want to do that sit-down interview." Jasmine looked up from the documents. "Tell them the same thing I've told everyone else. The evidence speaks for itself. I don't need to." "But think about the platform," Marcus insisted. "You could reach millions of people. You could explain what all this means." Jasmine smiled and gestured toward her computer screen, which was showing a TikTok video of teenagers chanting, "This isn't a debate, this is a breach," at a climate change rally. "Marcus, I think the message is getting out just fine." She returned to her work, knowing that somewhere in America, federal employees were finding the courage to speak up about corruption they had witnessed. Somewhere, young people were deciding to get involved in politics for the first time. Somewhere, the system that had seemed unshakable was beginning to bend toward accountability. The binder that had started it all sat on her desk, no longer the most important document in the room. Because the real power had never been in the folder itself, it had been in the idea that evidence, properly presented and strategically deployed, could still make a difference in a democracy that many people had given up on. Jasmine had proven that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply telling the truth with surgical precision at exactly the right moment. And that truth, once released, had a power all its own. The domino effect was just getting started. 3 months before her historic presentation, Jasmine Crockett had never intended to become the person who would bring down a presidency with a black leather folder. She had been focused on constituent services, working on infrastructure bills for her Texas district, and learning the complex rhythms of congressional life as a freshman representative. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in July, when she was reviewing routine federal expenditure reports as part of her assignment to the House Budget Committee. Most members found these reports mind-numbingly boring, thousands of pages of line items, contract details, and bureaucratic language that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate how taxpayer money was being spent. But Jasmine had spent 15 years as a trial attorney, and she had learned to read financial documents the way other people read novels. Every number told a story, every discrepancy suggested a question, and every pattern revealed the truth that someone was trying to hide. On page 847 of the General Services Administration's quarterly report, she found an entry that made her pause. Lodging and conference services, Trump International Hotel, Washington, D.C., $127,450. The amount itself wasn't unusual. Federal agencies regularly paid for lodging and meeting spaces. What caught her attention was the vendor. She remembered the years of controversy about Trump's business interests, the promises of blind trusts, and the assurances that there would be no conflicts of interest between the presidency and the family business empire. Jasmine pulled up her laptop and began cross-referencing the payment with other government databases. What she found made her stomach drop. The payment to Trump International Hotel wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that stretched back to the very beginning of the Trump administration, a systematic flow of federal money to Trump-owned properties that had been hidden in plain sight within the massive federal bureaucracy. She spent the rest of that day digging deeper, pulling expenditure reports from multiple agencies, cross-referencing vendor lists, and building a timeline that grew more disturbing with each new piece of information she uncovered. By the end of the week, she had identified over $15 million in federal payments to Trump properties. By the end of the month, that number had grown to $32 million, and that was just from the documents she could access through routine congressional oversight. Jasmine realized she needed help. She called her former law partner, Maria Santos, who had specialized in forensic accounting and white-collar criminal defense, before Jasmine convinced her to join her congressional staff as legislative counsel. "Maria," Jasmine said during a late-night phone call, "I need you to look at something. But I need you to understand that once you see this, there's no going back. This isn't just another political scandal. This is evidence of systematic corruption at the highest levels of government." Maria agreed to come in over the weekend to review what Jasmine had found. When she arrived at the office on Saturday morning, she was expecting to spend a few hours helping her boss understand some complicated financial documents. Instead, she found herself staring at evidence of what appeared to be the largest presidential conflict of interest scandal in American history. "Jesus, Jasmine," Maria whispered as she reviewed the bank routing records. "Do you understand what you found here?" "I think so," Jasmine replied, "but I need you to tell me if I'm seeing this correctly." Maria spent the next 6 hours reviewing every document, checking every source, and verifying every claim. When she was finished, she looked up at Jasmine with an expression of disbelief and determination. "This isn't just a conflict of interest," Maria said. "This is a federal crime. Multiple federal crimes, actually. Emoluments violations, ethics law violations, and potentially fraud and conspiracy charges." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Maria replied. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" That question would define the next 3 months of Jasmine's life. Together, Jasmine and Maria developed a systematic approach to documenting every aspect of what they were uncovering. They divided their investigation into 3 phases: collection, verification, and presentation. During the collection phase, they used every tool available to a member of Congress to gather evidence. Jasmine submitted dozens of Freedom of Information Act requests to federal agencies. She used her position on the Budget Committee to request detailed expenditure reports. She reached out to contacts in the career civil service who might have access to internal documents. The verification phase was even more meticulous. Every document had to be authenticated, every source verified, every claim cross-referenced with independent evidence. Maria brought in a network of forensic accountants, former federal prosecutors, and ethics experts who could help them understand the legal implications of what they were discovering. But it was the presentation phase that would prove to be the most crucial. Jasmine understood that in Washington, evidence was only as powerful as the way it was communicated. She had seen countless investigations disappear into partisan gridlock because the facts were too complex, the documentation too dense, or the presentation too political. She was determined not to let that happen. Working with a data visualization expert from Georgetown University, Jasmine and her team began creating charts, timelines, and graphics that could make the complex financial relationships understandable to anyone. They color-coded transactions by agency and property. They created timeline graphics that showed the flow of money over time. They built comparative charts that demonstrated the scope of the corruption. But the most important decision was about tone and approach. "We're not politicians making accusations," Jasmine told her team during one of their planning sessions. "We're prosecutors presenting evidence. We let the facts speak for themselves, and we let the audience draw their own conclusions." This approach required discipline that was almost military in its precision. Every word would be verified, every claim documented, every assertion backed by irrefutable evidence. There would be no speculation, no hyperbole, no emotional appeals, just mathematics. As the evidence mounted, word began to leak that Jasmine was working on something significant. Other members of Congress started asking questions. Reporters began making inquiries. The Trump administration's allies in Congress started making preemptive attacks on investigations they didn't yet understand but clearly feared. Jasmine's response was always the same. When the evidence is ready, it will speak for itself. 2 weeks before her scheduled presentation, Jasmine made a decision that surprised even her closest advisors. She decided to test her approach. She scheduled a private briefing for the Democratic leadership of the House Oversight Committee, including Chairman Jerry Nadler and ranking members from both the Budget and Judiciary Committees. She wanted to see how her evidence would be received by experienced politicians who had seen every kind of scandal and investigation. The briefing took place in a secure conference room in the Capitol basement. Jasmine presented exactly the same material she planned to use in the public hearing, with the same charts, the same tone, and the same methodical approach. When she finished, the room was silent for nearly a minute. Finally, Chairman Nadler spoke. "Congresswoman Crockett, in 30 years of congressional oversight, I have never seen evidence this comprehensive or this damaging. Are you absolutely certain about every detail?" "Every dollar, every date, every document has been verified by independent sources," Jasmine replied. "We have authentication from forensic accountants, confirmation from ethics experts, and corroboration from career federal employees." "And you're planning to present this in a public hearing?" "Yes, sir. 5 minutes, just the facts." Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who had been silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke up. "Jasmine, you realize this is going to change everything, right? This isn't just about Trump. This is about whether our system of government can hold powerful people accountable." Jasmine nodded. "I understand the implications, but I also understand that if we don't act on evidence this clear, we're telling every future president that corruption is acceptable as long as you're clever about hiding it." The meeting ended with unanimous support for Jasmine's approach, but also with warnings about the personal and political consequences she would face. "They're going to come after you with everything they have," warned Representative Jamie Raskin, who had led the Trump impeachment proceedings. "Your background, your family, your motivations, everything will be fair game." "Then they'll find a boring life and a commitment to the rule of law," Jasmine replied. "I can live with that." The night before her presentation, Jasmine couldn't sleep. She spent the early morning hours in her office, reviewing her materials one final time and thinking about the magnitude of what she was about to unleash. Her phone buzzed with a text from her grandmother in Dallas. "Baby girl, I saw on the news that you're doing something important tomorrow. Remember what I always told you, the truth doesn't need to be loud to be powerful." Jasmine smiled and typed back, "Love you, Grandma. Truth is all I've got." What she didn't know was that at that very moment, federal employees across Washington were making their own decisions about truth and consequences. Sarah Martinez, the GSA administrator who would later become the first whistleblower to come forward, was in her Arlington apartment reading news reports about Jasmine's upcoming presentation. Sarah had been keeping her own private files about the Trump property contracts for 2 years, documenting every irregularity and every concern that had been dismissed by her supervisors. "If she's brave enough to go public," Sarah told her husband that night, "then maybe it's time for me to be brave too." Similar conversations were happening in apartments and homes across the D.C. metropolitan area, as career civil servants who had been silenced by bureaucracy and threatened by political pressure began to consider the possibility that someone might finally listen to what they had to say. The morning of her presentation, Jasmine arrived at the Capitol early. She wanted time to center herself, to review her materials one final time, and to prepare mentally for what she knew would be the most important 5 minutes of her political career. As she walked through the halls of Congress, carrying the black binder that would soon become famous, she thought about all the people who had helped make this moment possible. Maria Santos, who had verified every document, the forensic accountants who had authenticated every transaction, the career federal employees who had trusted her with sensitive information, the data visualization expert who had made complex corruption understandable. But most of all, she thought about the American people who deserved to know that their tax dollars weren't being used to enrich the family of the person they had elected to serve them. When she entered the hearing room that morning, Jasmine had no way of knowing that her presentation would trigger the largest political earthquake in modern American history. She had no idea that "this isn't a debate, this is a breach" would become the rallying cry for a generation. She couldn't have predicted that federal agencies would turn against their own administration or that young people would create a cultural phenomenon around her words. All she knew was that she had evidence of corruption, and she had an opportunity to present that evidence to the American people. The rest, as they say, would be history. As she took her seat and waited for her name to be called, Jasmine opened the black binder one final time and looked at the first page. A simple title page that read, "Federal Payments to Trump Properties, a Comprehensive Analysis." 47 pages of evidence, 5 minutes of presentation. One moment that would change everything. She was ready. The future of American democracy might just depend on what happened next. But for now, there was only the waiting, the preparation, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're about to tell the truth in a place where truth had become a rare and powerful commodity. In 3 hours, everyone in Washington would be talking about the binder. In 3 days, federal employees would be coming forward with their own evidence. In 3 weeks, the Department of Justice would be opening criminal investigations. In 3 months, a presidency would be fundamentally transformed by the power of documentation and the courage of one congresswoman who understood that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply doing the math. But for now, there was only Jasmine Crockett, sitting in a hearing room with a black leather folder, waiting for her chance to change the world with 5 minutes of verified truth. The domino effect was about to begin. Dokuz yüz kelimelik hikaye eklentisi. The binder that shook Washington, final chapter. 6 months after the binder presentation, Jasmine Crockett stood in the Russell Senate office building, preparing to testify before a joint congressional committee investigating the most comprehensive corruption case in presidential history. But this time, she wasn't alone. Beside her sat Sarah Martinez, the former GSA administrator whose leaked memos had corroborated Jasmine's evidence. Next to Sarah was Dr. Michael Chen, a forensic accountant from Georgetown, who had helped authenticate the financial documents. Behind them, in the gallery, sat 12 other federal whistleblowers who had come forward with additional evidence after Jasmine's presentation. What had started as one congresswoman with a black binder had become a movement. The American people deserve to know what we've learned in the 6 months since Representative Crockett's initial presentation, announced Committee Chairman Chuck Schumer. The evidence she provided wasn't just the beginning, it was the key that unlocked decades of systematic corruption. The investigation that followed Jasmine's presentation had exceeded everyone's expectations. The Department of Justice had opened criminal probes into 17 different areas of potential lawbreaking. The Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network had identified over $200 million in suspicious transactions between government agencies and Trump-related entities. The Government Accountability Office had issued a scathing report documenting systematic violations of emoluments law spanning the entire administration. But perhaps the most significant development had been the cultural awakening that Jasmine's words had triggered. "This isn't a debate, this is a breach," had become more than a viral phrase. It had become a framework for accountability that was being applied far beyond presidential corruption. Young climate activists used the phrase to challenge politicians who claimed to support environmental protection while taking donations from fossil fuel companies. Labor organizers adopted it when confronting corporations that proclaimed support for workers while fighting union negotiations. Student debt advocates chanted it outside Department of Education buildings when officials claimed to be helping borrowers while enriching loan servicing companies. The phrase had given an entire generation the vocabulary to distinguish between political theater and actual wrongdoing. Jasmine's presentation had also fundamentally changed how Congress approached oversight. The Crockett Standard, named after her methodical, evidence-based approach, had become the gold standard for congressional investigations. No longer were members satisfied with partisan accusations or political theater. They wanted documentation, verification, and mathematical precision. Before Jasmine Crockett, congressional oversight was about scoring political points, explained Professor Elena Rodriguez, who taught government accountability at Harvard Kennedy School. After her presentation, it became about building prosecutorial cases that could withstand legal scrutiny. The Trump administration's response had been swift and predictable, and ultimately devastating to their credibility. Initially, they had dismissed Jasmine's evidence as fake news and another Democratic witch hunt. Trump himself had tweeted that the documents were completely fabricated by radical Democrats who want to destroy our great success. But when federal employees began coming forward with corroborating evidence, and when the Treasury Department confirmed the authenticity of the bank records, the administration's denials became increasingly desperate and contradictory. The turning point came when Eric Trump appeared on Fox News to defend the family's business practices and inadvertently confirmed several key details from Jasmine's presentation. "Look, we never hid anything," Eric had said during the interview. "All these payments were processed through normal channels. The government needed conference space. We provided conference space. It's called business." The clip became a social media sensation overnight, with millions of people sharing Eric Trump's accidental admission that the family had indeed received the federal payments that they had previously denied. 2 weeks later, the Trump Organization announced that it was voluntarily terminating all federal contracts and would no longer bid on government business. But the political consequences were far more severe than the business impact. Republican members of Congress who had initially rallied to defend the president began quietly distancing themselves as the evidence mounted. Several GOP senators called for full transparency and complete accountability. 3 Republican House members joined Democratic calls for a special prosecutor. The electoral impact was equally dramatic. In the midterm elections that followed, candidates who had voted against investigating the corruption revelations lost at unprecedented rates. Young voters, energized by Jasmine's example and motivated by the "this is a breach" framework, turned out in record numbers. Jasmine herself had become something unexpected, a political superstar who refused to act like one. She continued to decline most interview requests, focusing instead on the substantive work of oversight and accountability. When 60 Minutes finally convinced her to do a sit-down interview, she spent most of the time talking about the importance of institutional reform rather than her personal story. "I didn't do this to become famous," she told correspondent Anderson Cooper. "I did it because our democracy doesn't work if corruption becomes normalized. The moment we stop being shocked by the abuse of power is the moment we lose everything that makes America worth defending." The interview became one of the most watched 60-minute segments in history, but Jasmine used the platform to highlight the federal employees who had risked their careers to come forward with evidence rather than to promote herself. Sarah Martinez and the other whistleblowers are the real heroes, she insisted. I just had access to a microphone in 5 minutes to use it. They're the ones who had been documenting these problems for years, waiting for someone to listen. The hearing room erupted in applause, not the partisan clapping typical of congressional hearings, but something deeper. It was the sound of people witnessing democracy actually working. Outside the Russell Building, a group of college students had gathered with signs reading, "Do the math," and "Evidence greater than politics." They weren't protesting. They were celebrating. Celebrating the idea that their government could still be held accountable when citizens demanded it. The binder had shaken Washington. But more importantly, it had reminded America that the truth, properly documented and courageously presented, still had the power to change the world. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in a democracy isn't rhetoric or politics. It's evidence, presented with surgical precision by someone who refuses to let corruption hide behind complexity. Jasmine Crockett proved that 5 minutes of documented truth can be more powerful than years of political theater. Her binder that shook Washington became a blueprint for accountability. Do the research, verify the facts, and let the evidence speak for itself. If this story reminded you that real change happens when preparation meets courage, hit that like button and subscribe to Scale of Justice. We bring you the moments when documentation defeats deflection, when facts trump spin, and when one person's meticulous preparation changes everything. Ring that notification bell, because the next time someone arms themselves with evidence and speaks truth to power, you'll want to witness history in the making. What's your... This isn't a debate, this is a breach moment. When have you seen truth cut through political noise? Share it in the comments below. Let's celebrate the power of evidence-based accountability and the people who refuse to let mathematics lie.